Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph and we will be learning today Mi'as Hashem Daf Lamed Vav Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn halachos tefillin and we pick up today top line of Lamed Vav Amud Bayis Siman Chav Zayin. We are in the midst of Sif Aleph. We pick up in the midst of the words of the Ramah, middle of the line, top line, Lamed Vav Amud Bayis. The Mechaber has been discussing the proper placement of the tefillin Shel Yad. Says the Ramah, Gidem, an amputee, she'en lo yad, who does not have a hand, rak zeroya, but he still does have part of the arm, and we will discuss precisely what that means. Yaniach b'loi baracha, he should put on the tefillin, albeit without a bracha. And the Ramah brings this down in the name of Tosfos in Menachos Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph. He says, Tosfos says, Kasfu, the Gidem Chayiv. Tosfos says that the Gidem is Chayiv. And the implication of Tosfos is that the Gidem is Chayiv to put on tefillin, and that he should do so with a bracha. Uba Arzarua, however, in the Arzarua, Kasav the Potter, the Arzarua writes that the Gidem is actually Potter. And it's because of this that we have this question whether or not we should recite a bracha, because we have a machlokes, Tosfos and the Arzarua over here. Sorry, don't mind me playing with the light over here. I just need to shed a little more light on my Mishnah Berurah. Okay. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Hey, a Gidem she'en lo yad, an amputee who does not have a hand. Ritzayna Loimar, what the Ramah wants to say is, what does it mean she'en lo yad? Precisely what does he have and what doesn't he have? Ritzayna Loimar, what the Ramah wants to say is, Shenitel pisas yad smoiloi, the palm of his right hand. When I say the palm, I don't mean just this, the hand itself. The pisas yad smoiloi was removed, im kol hakone, together with the entire forearm, the section of the arm that begins with the hand and terminates at the elbow. Kol hakone ad hakevadoi, shenikra elenbeigen, which is called the elbow. Aval, however, im nishak tzas mehakone, if part of the forearm down from the elbow towards the hand, if part of the forearm remains, then Gama Arzarua Moidel HaTosfos Chayiv B'Tefillin, then the Arzarua would also agree that this amputee is Chayiv in Tefillin, V'yavarech Gamkein, and then such a person would put on Tefillin and he would do so with a bracha. Kain Motzasi Ba'Arzarua, the Chavetz Chaim says, so I have found in the Arzarua, Asher Zachinu Mikarav La'oroi. The Chavetz Chaim says that this Arzarua had just become extant in his time. It was the Arzarua, till then he had heard about the sheet of the Arzarua, but it was, so to speak, hearsay. But at that point in time, the ksavim of the Arzarua became available, and he says that, note his lashon, Asher zachinu mikarav la'oroi, that we just recently merited the light of being able to see the Arzarua in print. Eis Katan Vav, the Ramah said that such a person would put on tefillin b'loi bracha. Ayin b'bir Halachah, he sends us to the bir Halachah dibur hamaschil b'loi bracha, where I could read part of it. The Chavetz Chaim writes here in the bir Halachah, me'abach v'nachlas tzvi ve'eli rabba v'hagra mashma d'tzarech levarech gamkein. This very impressive list of achronim, they are mashma that the Gidem actually should put on the tefillin with a bracha. Acharei diyesh loi ki Bayis, because even if the Gidem doesn't have a forearm, so it's the arm has been amputated from the elbow and down, but he still has the makam tefillin, because the makam tefillin, Chazal say, is the ki Bayis, is on the bicep, like we discussed yesterday. So these achronim are mashma that really the Gidem should put on tefillin with a bracha. V'derech HaChaim gamkein maskim be'ikra din l'chiyuv k'maisam. Derech HaChaim also seems to be maskim. However, mikol makom le'inyin bracha mitzadid lahakel. But when it comes to the question of making a bracha, the Derech HaChaim is makel and says, don't make a bracha. Va'afilu lo nisha lo rak mechatzi ha'etzem shebein ha'kevada yubeis ha'shechi u'lamayla. Says the Chavetz Chaim, even if more of the arm has been removed, some more of the arm upwards from the elbow has been removed, and maybe only half of the arm from the shoulder down to the elbow is still there, Pashat Yachal Lismach Bazeh Al Shitas Hagra, you could still rely on the Shitas Hagra that we learned about yesterday, that Kol Sheyesh Adayin Miktas Mina Kibayris Kasher L'Tfilin, as long as part of the bicep is still intact, so that he could still put on tefillin on part of the bicep, still you could be Saimach on the Shitas Hagra, and we could say that that's kasher l'tefillin v'lo yavarech. However, you should not make a bracha. What's the Shitas Hagra that he's referring to? This is the Shitas Hagra that we learned yesterday. We said that the tefillin properly are supposed to be situated on the bicep, but on the lower half of the upper arm. The Gra said, as long as you put the tefillin on the muscle, on the bicep, even if it's on the upper half of the upper arm, that's still okay. So now the Bir Halachah is saying an amputee who only has the upper half of the upper arm, but if he still has part of the kibayris, if part of the bicep is still there, so put tefillin on the bicep over there and be saimach on the Shitas Hagra, but don't make a bracha. Okay, we'll stop the Bir Halachah over there. Now let's go back to Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Vav. Second line in the Ois Katan. Ve'em ein lo yad small klal. Let's say somebody chas v'chalila doesn't have a left arm at all. It's been entirely removed. Oy afilu kitzei azaraya shalamala mimakam akibayris nishar. Or he has a little bit left of the arm from the shoulder going down, but it terminates before the bicep. So the entire bicep, the entire kibayris is gone. So this person does not have the makam tefillin left on his left arm at all. Says the Mishnah Berurah, in such a case, pater milahanyach hashel yad af biyamin. Such a person is pater for putting on the shel yad, and don't think that the chiyuv now transfers onto his right arm. No, his makam tefillin has been lost. The makam tefillin was the left arm. Now he doesn't have the left arm anymore. It doesn't now transfer to the right arm. However, the Mishnah Berurah does say v'yesh machmirin bazeh. There are those who are machmir. He tells us to look at the chuvas at the chuvas Yaakov and the Artzas Achayim, and he says, "V'al kol panim b'li bracha." At least he should put on the tefillin on the right arm without a bracha. V'chol zeh shenase gidem b'smail duhu makom hanachas hatefillin. And this whole discussion is only germane to somebody who has lost his left arm. Avalim nase gidem biyamin. But let's say somebody became an amputee on the right arm. Now, it's very difficult for him to put on tefillin, very hard to put tefillin on your left arm if you don't have a right hand and arm with which to tie it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, afilu nikta loy kol yad, even if somebody would lose his entire right arm, chas v'chalila, chayiv b'tefillin, he's still chayiv b'tefillin because he has the makam tefillin. And he should ask assistance from somebody else to help him put on tefillin. I have this memory stuck in my mind. I remember davening once in Rabbi Landau's shul in Flatbush, and an older man came in. I don't know if he was a victim of a stroke or something else, but it was very apparent that his right arm was virtually paralyzed. And I saw him take out his tefillin, and I said to myself, maybe I should go offer to help him put on his tefillin. But it's a very tricky situation, because sometimes people like that don't want help. They want to be independent. So I waited to see what he would do, and I watched. I was just fascinated by how he put on his tefillin. He put on his tefillin perfectly, without any problems, without any difficulty. He had it down to a science, how he grasped the Bayis between his arm and his body, and then he used his teeth, and he used his chin, and it was just fascinating to watch. But he put on his tefillin, and he put on his tefillin in the proper manner. Now we go to Sif Bayis, 3 lines down in the Shulchan Aruch, says the Mechaber. Haminig hanochaim. The proper minig is sheyehei hayud shel kesher tefillah shel yad. And I took out a shel yad over here. The yud, that's the kesher. Here we have the kesher of the shel yad is shaped like a yud, right? Here we have the top, here we have the leg. So the kesher, the yud of the shel yad. Haminig hanochain sheyayud shel kesher tefillah shel yad litzad halev. It should be on the side to the body, to the heart. So, of course, you don't put on your tefillin like I'm doing right now over your clothing, but I'm just doing this for illustrative purposes. So, I have the tefillin over here. You can see the kesher. Here's the kesher over here. So the kesher is litzad halev. It's not on the outside of the bayis. It's on the inside of the bayis, facing my body, facing the lave. So haminig hanochain sheyayud shel kesher tefillah shel yad litzad halev. Va'tefillah alav, and the tefillah, the bayis of the shel yad, is on top of it, litzad chutz. And I'll show you what he means by that. It's maybe unfortunate that I'm wearing a black chalat over here, so the bayis kind of matches. It's a little hard to see, but let me just do this so you can get an idea. Here you have the bayis. Where's the kesher? So if I swing my arm out, you'll see the kesher is over here. Now note, I put on, remember we learned yesterday, you're supposed to put on the Shel Yad so that if you turn your arm down, the bayis is facing the body. Now in this position, where is the kesher? The kesher is beneath the bayis. And that's what the Mechaber means over here, that hatfila alav, the tefillah, the bayis, is on top of it. Litzad chutz, on the outside. What do you mean outside? Well, klape, the body, my body is over here. Then comes the kesher, the yud, right, in here. And then going outwards away from my body, here is the tefillah. Here's the bayis. So the bayis is alav, it's on top of the kesher, litzad chutz, outside, going further away from the guf. Okay, let's see the Mishnah Berurah over here. Ois kat zayin, haminig hanochain. The Mechaber said this is the proper minig. Ayin bebir agra, he tells us, take a look at the bir agra, Shekasav, who writes, Dedina de Gemarahu lepirish haga'onim, that even though the way the Mechaber writes this is he says it's the minig hanochain, says the Mishnah Berurah, it's not only the minig nochain. The Gra writes that it's dina de Gemara lepirish haga'onim. The Ga'onim learned that this is me'ikar adin, it's dina de shas, it's something that comes from a Gemara. Ois kat neches, sheyehei hayud. Ayin bebir halacha, he says, take a look at the bir halacha shekasavnu, where we wrote, shenachain lizaher, it is proper to take care, shelo yarchiv harbe es kefel kesher ha'aniva, that you should not make the loop, and I will show you what this means in a moment. You should not make the loop that comes off of the kesher of the Shel Yad, you should not make it very wide. Shelo yarchiv harbe, you should not make very wide as kefel kesher ha'aniva, the folded loop of the knot, shaharitzua iverespa, that the ritzua of the Shel Yad goes in, kedei shetia gam mekayim hiduk haritzua samach lahatfilin, so that the place where you tighten the ritzua should be next to the bayis, litzad alev, on the side of the bayis next to the lave. What is he talking about? I'll show you. But over here, we have a difference between what we call nowadays minig Sfard and minig Ashkenaz. I put on my tefillin according to the minig of Sfard. What does that mean? Well, when I put on my tefillin, I tighten the ritzua, and I wrap around my arm going away from my body. I'm wrapping this way, okay? That's minig Sfard. Minig Ashkenaz goes the other way. Minig Ashkenaz, the ritzua wouldn't be coming out going in this direction. It would be coming out from the other side of the bayis, going around my arm this way, and I would be winding towards me. What's the difference practically on the bayis? Very simple. Here we have the bayis of the Shel Yad. Here's the kesher. Now, if you take a look at the kesher, you'll see that on one side of the kesher, I have a single ritzua coming out. On the other side of the kesher, going this way, a loop comes off of the kesher, goes through the mabarta. It goes through this part of the bayis, and it comes out on the other side. See, here's the loop. Now, the single strap of the ritzua that comes out from this side of the kesher comes down here, and it goes through the loop that comes out on the other side. I put it in my arm. I put it in this way in my arm, and now the single ritzua, it's coming through the loop over here. Now, when I put the Bayis on, you'll see where is the mokim hiduk haritzua in the words of the Mishnah Berurah. It's not neged alev. It's not over here close to the heart. It's on the other side of the Bayis. It's on the outside of the Bayis, the loop. The loop is over here, and the mokim hiduk haritzua, where I tighten it, is over here. It's on the outside of my arm. Now, that's not what the Mishnah Berurah says here. The Mishnah Berurah says over here, Ayin bebir halachah shekasavnu, where we wrote shenachal lizar, that it's proper to take care. Shelo yarchiv harbe es kefel kesher ani v'shar atzua iverespa. The loop should not be big; it should be small. Kidei shetia gam mekoyim hiduk haritzua, so that the place where you tighten the ritzua, that's over here, where the ritzua goes through its loop. That's where you tighten it. That place should be samuch la tefillin, next to the Bayis, litzad halev, next to the heart. But my Bayis is not that way. My Bayis is the opposite of what Mishnah Berurah just wrote. Why? Because I told you I put on tefillin like the minig of Sfard. According to the minig of Sfard, when the batemacher or the sofer makes the kesher, the way he makes the kesher is the way I described to you. The single ritzua exits the kesher on the side that's next to the body. The loop that ritzua is going to go through exits the kesher on the inside. On the inside of the kesher, goes through the mavarta, comes out the other side, so that this, the mokim hiduk haritzua, is situated away from the body, on the outside. Minig Ashkenaz is fakert. Minig Ashkenaz, when they make the ritzua, they tie it so that the double strap, the loop, comes out on this side, on the outside of the Bayis. That's where the loop is. The single ritzua exits the other side of the kesher, goes through the mavarta, comes out this way. So, if you're putting on tefillin like Minig Ashkenaz, I'll show you a little bit what it looks like just by flipping my Bayis upside down. If you would put on like Minig Ashkenaz, so then you would have like this. And it's a little awkward for me to do it because I never do it this way. Tighten it. Okay. See, now you'll see, now the loop is on this side. The loop is next to the body. And the mokim hiduk haritzua is next to the body. Now that's not really Ashkenaz, because you see here, because I've svared tefillin, now my kesher is on the wrong side. My kesher is here. Ashkenaz, the kesher is here, and the loop comes out over here. So now, just if I take the Bayis off now, what the Mishnah Berurah is saying when he says that the loop should not be made wide, what he means is on Ashkenaz tefillin, where the kesher is here and the loop comes out over here on this side of the kesher, he's saying make it short. Make the loop short. If the loop would be short, so then the mokim hiduk haritzua, when you tighten it on the body, would be right here, right? Let's imagine for a moment, I'll try to pull it. Can't really see. Could you see the loop? See the loop over here? Imagine that the loop was coming off the kesher right here. If the loop is short, so then the ritzua would pass through the loop right here next to the kesher, which would be right next to the Bayis, next to the lave. If you would make the loop large, where it comes off the kesher, then the loop would travel under here. And again, it would be far away from the Bayis, and it would be on the other side. So really, Minig Ashkenaz could fulfill this Mishnah Berurah. Minig Sfard really cannot. However, even in Minig Sfard, in a sense, the mokim hiduk haritzua is neged alev, because where is it? It's over here. It's over here. So it still is somewhat neged alev. Now, I have a funny feeling that as I'm saying the share here, I'm addressing a number of people who, like me, do put on tefillin according to the minhag Sfard. So to give you kind of a consolation prize, you should just take a look at the Bir Halachah, Dibur HaMaschil, HaMinhag HaNocha in Sheyehei Ayud Shel Kesher, where he begins this Bir Halachah by bringing down a Mahari ben Chaviv. Ayin bebeis Yosef b'shem Mahari ben Chaviv, the mashma midvarav, it's implied from his words, Darak asiyas ha-kesher v'hayud asher boi. It's only the actual kesher with its yud, tzar sheyadafka lamata me'atfilu l'chad alev. That it's only the kesher itself that has to be situated beneath the Bayis. It has to be neged alev. Ava knisas ha-ritzua toich kefal ha-kesher, but where the ritzua passes through the loop, where you tighten it, tavai lamayla me'atfilu. That should be above the Bayis, like it is according to Nusach Sfard. V'hu anachain, and that's the proper way to do it. Ayin sham. So he says, the Beis Yosef actually says Nusach Sfard. Aval b'darkei Moshe mashma sheyosef tayv keminik shenaygen shegam tchivas haritzua b'sach hakesher v'hakefel yel yamina yishul etzad alev. Okay, the Ramah is mashma not that way. He brings down also a bahag. So okay, but obviously there's two different minhagim, and we have two very prevalent minhagim nowadays. Okay. Now if we go back into the Mishnah Berurah Eis Katan Ches, we did Eis Katan Ches. Now Eis Katan Tes. In the words of the Mechaber said that the tefillah should be alav. The tefillin should be on top of the kesher. Now I showed you what that means. What that means is that when the Bayis is positioned on the body, it's positioned in this direction so that the kesher is beneath and the tefillah is above. Now the Mishnah Berurah just wants to make sure that you have no misunderstanding. Don't think that the kesher is supposed to be down here underneath the Bayis. Says the Mishnah Berurah, he doesn't mean that the Bayis should be on top of the yud, on top of the kesher. Certainly the kesher, the yud, has to be next to the Bayis, not underneath it. All he means to say is, since you're turning the Bayis so that it faces the guf, like we learned yesterday in Sif Aleph, that's why it's called that the kesher is underneath the tefillah, because it's positioned underneath it. Tefillah olav l'tzad maila, where the Bayis is on top of it. Okay, now let's go back into the Mechaber, a very important halacha, 4 lines down in the Shulchan Aruch, in the middle of the line. A lot of people aren't aware of this halacha. Yesh li zaher. It is proper to take care. Shaloi tazuz yud shel kesher, that the yud of the kesher of the Shel Yad should not move mei hatfila from the Bayis itself. Meaning that the kesher should be physically touching the Bayis. It should not be like this. It shouldn't be distant. You see the gap I just created between the yud and the Bayis? No, it should not be that way. It should be touching the Bayis. Now again, here is another place where Nusach Sfard actually has an edge over Nusach Ashkenaz. Because in Nusach Sfard, when we tighten our tefillin, let me get this unbollocked up over here. Okay. Since we're putting on the tefillin in this direction, when we tighten it and we pull on the loop is on this, going through the mabarta on this side. When we put pressure on the loop and we pull it, we're actually pulling the yud tighter against the Bayis. Masha'enke Nusach Ashkenaz, if the loop is on this side of the kesher, then when we put pressure on the loop, what happens is there's a tendency to pull, right? Because the loop would be here, and now we're pulling it, so we're actually pulling the kesher away from the Bayis, whereby Nusach Sfard, we're actually pulling the kesher to the Bayis. But regardless, whether you put on the minig Sfard or minig Ashkenaz, the halacha remains the same, and that is that the yud is supposed to be touching the Bayis. Okay, Says the Mishnah Berurah is cotton yud. Yesh li zahir. It is proper to take care. Ubezayar Pashas Pinchas, in the Zayar and Pashas Pinchas, machmer ma'oid be'inyan zeh. The Zayar al pi Kabbalah was very machmer when it came to this. And get a load of this, what we're going to say now, and he brings this down from the Shari Tshuva. V'yesh machmirin, there are those that are machmir. The gam kishehein b'soich kisan, even when the tefillin are in their bag, tzrichin lizar, we have to take care, shaloi tazuz klal hayud, that the yud should not move away from the bayis. So it's not only an inyan that when you put your tefillin on, you should make sure to pull it next to it and it should be touching. No, it should be touching even when it's in the bag. It should never move. And for this reason, says the Chavetz Chaim, yesh dayagin, there are those that have the minig, likshar hayud, to tie the yud, im chut shel gid, with a thread of gidin. The gidin are the sinews of the animal that we use to sew the bottom closed. So there's a minig to take a piece of gidin and to tie the kesher to the bayis. But the Chavetz Chaim says, v'roy levatel zeh, he says we should be mavatel this minig, dal yedei keshira, because as a result of this tying, yeh chut shel gid saviv hatitura, there ends up being a piece of a gid that goes around the titura, and it is chaytzeitz, it forms an interposition bein azraya lahatfillin, between the arm and the tefillin. What he means is like this. Now, just a basic education in the parts of the bayis. The upper part of the bayis over here, the box, the cube that contains the parashiyos, that's the bayis. The foundation of the bayis, so this square down here, this is called the titura. Then you have over here this section of the bayis that the ritzuas travel through, right? Here we have the kesher on one side over here, and the double loop in my tefillin. The double loop of the ritzua came from the kesher, and it goes through the ma'avarta. That's why it's called a ma'avarta. The word ma'avarta is like a crossing, a ma'avor yaboik. So this is like a crossing where the ritzua crosses through. That's the ma'avarta. Says the Chavetz Chaim like this. They had a minig that they would take a piece of a gid and they would tie it, they would loop it around the kesher, go under the titura, under the bayis, loop it around on this side, and make a loop, and use that to tie the kesher to the bayis. But if you do that, now you have a piece of gid that's going underneath the titura and is forming a chatzitza between the bayis and your arm. And that's something that we're going to learn later you're not supposed to have. Continues the Chavetz Chaim here, nice cut yud. He says, "Ulebelavushe srad kasav, the royal levatel gamkein aminig." You should also be mevatel the minig shekarchen haritzua b'mekayim hakibaris tachas hatitura. There are those people who, when they would put on their tefillin, and I don't know if they did this according to minig Sfard or according to minig Ashkenaz, but in either case, what they did was they tied the tefillin on. So here you have my tefillin are tied onto my arm, and then they came through, but then they passed the ritzua over here, under the bayis. Okay, you can see over here, right? Now you have the ritzua going underneath the bayis. So again, it's forming a chatzitza between the bayis and the arm. And the Levushei Srad says we should be mavatal that minig to have a gamkein chatzitza. Okay, now we go to Mishnah Berurah is cutting yud aleph. We said that the yud of the kesher should not be removed from the tefillah. The yachtoich patitura milamala, in order to facilitate the kesher being right next to the bayis, we should cut into the titura the yahade kayud im bayis, so that we could bring the yud and attach it close to the bayis. What he means, Rabbi Isai, is over here. I'll pull this away so you can see. Okay, you note over here on this side there's a very small cut into the mavarta. On this side, there's a deep cut into the mavarta. Why? Because that allows us to pull the kesher in tight, right? It comes in very tight here on the mavarta so that we could pull the kesher right next to the Bayis, and there should be no gap between the kesher and the Bayis. Okay, that brings us to Sif Gimel, and I'm going to stop over here, even though it's a little bit abbreviated, but Mirz Hashem, we will go a little bit weiter tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be vegan against Klal Yisrael, the Baruch Shem Shesen, Yeshua, Sefuas, Parnasa, Sheduchim to all those in need, and we should be zeichet to see the BSKL Tzedek, B'mher V'yameinu, Amen. Be well.